I had spent more than a decade keeping a logistics empire alive. And then a newly arrived vice president thought he could erase me with one all-caps Slack message. He did not understand that I was not an employee he could bark orders at. And he understood even less that the systems holding up his authority had been built by me. The moment he tried to push me out to prove he was powerful, he set off the collapse of the very machinery he was standing on. And he had no idea that his own arrogance was about to shut down dashboards, rattle investors, and throw him out of the company faster than he had entered it. The Slack alert on my screen that morning glowed a violent red. The kind of red that never means anything good in a system or in a workplace. The message itself was blunt, fully capitalized, and written with the swagger of someone who believed that volume could replace authority. Hand over the shared drive password and clear out your desk. It came from Mason Blake, the new vice president of operations. A man who had been in the building for only a short stretch of time and had already begun moving through it as if the company were a personal stage set built for his entrance. I stared at the message for a few seconds. Not because I was shaken, but because I was genuinely amazed by how foolish it was. My name is Claire Bennett. I am 49 years old. And I am not the kind of woman who can be thrown out of a business by instant message. For more than 11 years, I have been the independent systems architect for this logistics company. The person behind the infrastructure, nobody celebrates, and everybody depends on. There is a very specific silence in a server room, one scented with ozone, cold airflow, and the strange comfort of mechanical reliability. I have lived inside that soundscape long enough to know the heartbeat of this company better than most executives know their own strategy decks. So when Mason decided he could sever me from all of this with one reckless order, I did not feel panic. I felt something colder and more precise, like a safety clicking off inside my mind. He did not know who he was dealing with. More importantly, he had no idea that the work he wanted to seize did not live on that desk. The desk was decoration. The real work lived in encrypted channels, overnight scripts, hard-linked credentials, and infrastructure layers that people like Mason love to benefit from and are never qualified to touch. I had been with this company long enough to watch it evolve from a patched-together operation into a logistics network, capable of carrying an enormous operational load without falling apart. The numbers attached to that work were never just numbers to me. They were trucks moving through storms, warehouses syncing inventory in real time, medical shipments that could not arrive late, and compliance trails that could not be broken without consequences, rippling far beyond this office. I was never the face they put in the internal newsletter, never the polished speaker in strategy presentations, and never one of those people who needed applause to validate technical competence. I built the foundation. Foundations are not glamorous, but when they crack, all the glossy language above them turns into theater. For more than 11 years, I had been the woman who knew why the company's technical heart kept beating, especially during the ugly years. I had worked through downturns, budget squeezes, leadership turnover, and every fashionable management trend that arrived, made a mess, and disappeared. I repaired things. I hardened things. I rebuilt things after other people had nearly wrecked them. That alone made me valuable. But the detail that made Mason's behavior truly dangerous was legal. Not technical. I was not a salaried employee. I was an independent contractor operating under a service agreement. That meant the company could not casually blur the lines when it benefited them and then pretend I was disposable when a newly imported executive needed to prove he was in charge. I had my own business entity, a defined scope of work, deliverables that were spelled out in writing, and contractual protections so tight that anyone trying to bypass them was effectively stepping into a legal trap. Mason looked at a middle-aged woman in a polo shirt sitting in a corner workspace and assumed I was some aging technical holdover waiting to be phased out. What he failed to understand was that he was looking at the person who had built the structure he was trying to dominate. I understood Mason Blake almost immediately, because men like him have a recognizable rhythm. They arrive with immaculate resumes, expensive confidence, and the strange certainty that presentation is somehow interchangeable with competence. He had come in through the private equity pipeline, carrying the glossy biography of a man who had been professionally polished for rooms full of people who mistake jargon for depth. His suit was too perfect, his smile too trained, and his tone had that practiced blend of manufactured warmth and managerial command that always makes me think of someone rehearsing leadership in a mirror. A few days after he showed up, he strolled past my workstation, tapped the edge of my monitor with a ring he clearly wanted, noticed, and asked whether I could boost the Wi-Fi in the conference room so he could stream a leadership talk. At that exact moment, I was deep in database reconfiguration tied to shipping operations worth an enormous amount of money every day. And this man looked at me as if I were the person people call when the printer refuses to connect. I looked up and told him plainly that I did not handle conference room signal issues. I managed enterprise architecture, and if he had a connectivity problem, he could submit a standard support ticket. He laughed in that dry, clipped way insecure men do when they want to make expertise sound petty. Then he said something along the lines of technology, being technology, and encouraged me to be more agile about it. That was the moment I knew he could not tell the difference between the woman who designed the nervous system of this company and someone assigned to reset forgotten passwords. That kind of ignorance is not merely insulting. It is dangerous. Because the most destructive executives are rarely the ones who know nothing. They are the ones who know almost nothing, and mistake their confidence for understanding. If you have ever seen a manager like that, marching toward disaster with a smile on his face. Comment number 1. Because the moment Mason asked me about Wi-Fi, I knew I was dealing with exactly that kind of man. The more I watched Mason operate, the clearer it became that he had absolutely no understanding of the legal relationship between me and the company. A lot of people in the building had forgotten that I was not technically staff. Because I had been there long enough to feel woven into the place. I had a badge, a permanent workstation, access to the same bad break room coffee as everyone else, and enough institutional memory to know who was divorcing whom and which department was lying in budget season. Familiarity, however, does not create permission. My agreement was not an offer letter. It was a business-to-business services contract, written with the kind of precision that leaves no room for improvisation by power-hungry amateurs. If they wanted to terminate the arrangement, they had to provide 30 days of written notice. If they wanted to claim cause, they needed formal documentation. Board-level approval, reaching a threshold of 67%, and 3 independent technical reviews. If they breached those requirements, they were exposed to the full remaining contract value and punitive damages on top. My attorney, Daniel Mercier, writes, contracts the way some people engineer vault doors. Every clause exists because somebody, somewhere, once tried something stupid. Years earlier, the company had attempted to convert me to a standard employee in the name of operational efficiency. They failed, and the counterproposal they accepted instead became a legal fortress. Mason had obviously never read it. In truth, I doubted he had read much of anything beyond the parts of his own role that sounded powerful in meetings. He saw a woman who refused to be summoned on command and decided I was a legacy obstacle in need of removal. What chilled me was not that he underestimated me, it was that he was arrogant enough to start overriding boundaries before he even understood what those boundaries were protecting. After the Wi-Fi incident, my inbox began filling up with exactly the kind of corporate messages that make real work harder while pretending to support it. There were mandatory technology huddles, strategy alignment sessions, innovation workshops, and all the usual meetings designed to make executives feel like motion itself is progress. I skimmed each subject line and deleted every one of them without guilt. I was not under contract to sit in circles and listen to people who did not understand the infrastructure, explain vision to me. I was under contract to keep the infrastructure alive. My statement of work defined my deliverables with painful clarity. Tasks were assigned scope, time, rate, and approval conditions. If someone wanted me in a meeting outside that scope, there was a separate billing structure for that. It required advance authorization. And it was not cheap. Mason did not like the fact that I did not jump the second he invented a new forum for performative collaboration. He started hovering around my area like cigarette smoke in a closed room, forcing his presence into the atmosphere. I kept doing what I always did. I reviewed logs, stabilized backups, tuned bottlenecks, and documented technical realities that people like him loved to ignore until they needed rescuing. Some people think professionalism means smiling through every pointless team ritual. I have always believed professionalism means refusing to let someone else's ego interfere with systems that affect thousands of actual people. If that kind of steadiness makes sense to you, like the video. Because by then I already knew Mason was not going to stop at aggressive calendar invites. Men like him need confrontation, the way some people need applause. And sooner or later, he was going to force one. What he did not understand was that he had chosen the wrong woman to use as a demonstration of power. The confrontation came soon after. One afternoon, Mason leaned against the divider by my desk, with the false ease of a man trying very hard to look naturally authoritative. He said he had noticed I had not been at the stand-up the day before. I told him, without changing tone, that I had been migrating backup infrastructure so the investor reporting load would not choke the system later in the week, and that the work was already documented in the scope summary I had sent out. He narrowed his eyes as though my answer itself were a form of insubordination. Then he launched into the familiar sermon about team unity, about silos being the enemy, about building something bigger together. Listening to him use recycled management language on me was almost surreal. I told him directly that my contract covered technical services, not corporate philosophy sessions or morale exercises. That was when the mask slipped. His voice hardened, and he started throwing around the usual threat made by mediocre people. With temporary authority, everybody is replaceable. Technology is a commodity now, and services can be outsourced cheaply. I turned fully toward him and said my work was not a commodity. The systems I had built were structural load-bearing elements of the company. You do not rip out a foundation while still standing on the roof and expect the building to keep smiling for your presentation deck. He gave me that patronizing grin business school men practice when they want condescension to sound strategic. He talked about modernizing, about cloud tools, about cleaning house and dragging the place into a new century. But what I saw in his face was not vision. It was vanity. It was the look of a man who had never been forced to live with the consequences of his own technical ignorance. That was the moment I understood something with total certainty. Mason was not just incompetent. He was the more dangerous kind of incompetent. The kind convinced that confidence itself is a substitute for understanding. After that exchange, the atmosphere in the office shifted in a way seasoned people recognize instantly. Younger employees might miss it. But anyone who has survived enough reorganizations can feel instability before it is announced. It shows up in interrupted conversations, in executives moving faster than usual, in nervous glances that vanish the second someone walks by. Later that afternoon, Victor Hayes, our chief information officer, came by my desk carrying a mug in both hands like a man bracing himself against an incoming wave. Victor had been around long enough to develop the look of someone who had seen every fashionable management disaster already. He was not easy to rattle, which made the tension in his voice even more telling when he quietly informed me that Mason was demanding top-level credentials for everything: administrative access, root directories, backup archives, encryption material. I kept my eyes on the monitor while listening, but inside me every alarm was already going off. I asked if he had handed anything over. He said no, that he had cited procedure, legal review, and security policy. But Mason was framing resistance as obstruction and talking about eliminating inefficiencies. I let out a dry laugh. Mason wanted to audit a system he would not have recognized if it had introduced itself politely. The real danger was not that he wanted to read something he did not understand. It was that he believed his failure to understand it gave him no reason to hesitate. I told Victor to let him audit all he wanted, because he likely would not know what he was looking at anyway. But after Victor walked away, my last trace of casualness disappeared. Mason had moved past posturing. He was reaching for the live wires now. And once someone like that starts confusing access with mastery, the margin between office politics and an operational catastrophe gets very, very thin. That night, I went home to my apartment in the suburbs. But there was no rest in me. My home office glowed with the cold blue light of 3 monitors. A light that usually calmed me because it meant everything could still be mapped, checked, and understood. That evening, it looked more like the staging area before a controlled detonation. I pulled up my contract and read it line by line. slowly enough to feel the shape of every provision again. It was not that I had forgotten anything. I simply wanted absolute clarity before the next move came. Years earlier, when the company had tried to pull me into full-time employment under the banner of streamlining operations, Daniel Mercer had helped me build the agreement I still worked under. What they ended up signing was less a convenience document than a legal stronghold. Every path in or out was guarded. I reread the 30-day notice language, the termination for cause structure, the board approval threshold, the clauses protecting the intellectual property embedded in key credentials, and the restrictions against forced transfer without proper safeguards. The more I read, the calmer I became, because structure has always steadied me. When everything around me turns emotional, logic remains the floor under my feet. I understood Mason well enough by then to know what kind of move he was preparing. Men like him need a quick victory to justify their arrival. And to create one, they need a villain. I could already see the story he wanted to tell. Stubborn legacy contractor resists progress. New leadership steps in. Business transformed. The flaw in that fantasy was simple. He had chosen the wrong antagonist. The woman he was trying to frame as the obstacle was the same woman who understood where every hidden support beam ran. If you want to stay with me all the way through a collapse like this, subscribe to the channel. Because that night, sitting under the blue light and rereading the contract, I knew the next day would not be a normal workday. It would be the day his arrogance collided with reality. The next morning, everything broke open exactly the way I had expected. Only with even less subtlety. The Slack message sat in front of me like a blade dropped into the middle of the office routine. No formal notice. No attached document. No process. No evidence that he understood the legal and operational consequences of what he was doing. Just an order to surrender the shared drive password and clean out my desk. He had copied Emily Parker from Human Resources, as though involving HR in a reckless message would somehow transform it into a legitimate action. I did not answer immediately. One of the oldest rules in any kind of conflict is never to interrupt an opponent while he is making a disastrous mistake. Instead, I captured everything. The message content, the timestamp, the recipients, the formatting, every detail that would matter later when people started pretending they had been misunderstood. I did it carefully, the same way I preserve logs before risky changes. Because evidence matters more than outrage once the lawyers arrive. What Mason failed to understand was that my actual work did not live in a physical workspace. It lived in encrypted tunnels, in API credentials tied to warehouse automation, in overnight routines that touched mission-critical systems, while the corporate class was asleep. I opened my private business email, not the internal company environment he might attempt to interfere with, and wrote Daniel a message that was concise, clinical, and impossible to misread. The vice president of operations had attempted summary termination by Slack. No 30-day notice. No board action. No lawful process. He was also demanding credentials classified as protected intellectual property of my firm. I asked for immediate legal guidance. Then I hit send, leaned back, and took a sip of coffee that had long since gone cold. It tasted harsh and metallic. But in that moment, I almost appreciated it. Mason had just turned his little intimidation stunt into a documented breach. And I knew it. Not long after that, Mason came back to my workstation, looking irritated that I was still there. Still seated. Still working. And very obviously not obeying the fantasy version of authority he had projected onto the building. He stopped beside my desk and asked, loudly enough for the surrounding area to hear, whether I had gotten his message. I turned toward him and answered in a voice so controlled that even I could hear the steel in it. I told him I had received it and had already forwarded it to legal counsel for review. Because I was a vendor, not an employee, and any attempt to alter the service arrangement had to go through proper contractual channels. I watched the color shift in his face almost instantly. His anger was not the anger of a man who had been insulted. It was the anger of a man discovering that imagined power and actual power are not the same thing. He snapped that he was the vice president of operations, which meant he was the channel. I corrected him and said that he was a client representative and that the legal distance between those two roles was very large. He looked as though he might combust where he stood. Then he stormed toward human resources with the stiff aggression of someone who believes speed can compensate for being wrong. I stayed where I was, to minimize a few windows, reviewed some live tasks, and began deciding exactly how much courtesy the company was still entitled to from me under the circumstances. I had no intention of sabotaging anything. Sabotage is illegal, unethical, and beneath me. But I also had no reason to continue providing layers of invisible convenience while someone attempted to coerce control over my work in violation of the agreement. My calm in that moment was not theatrical. It came from years of knowing that panic is the enemy of technical judgment. Mason, on the other hand, was operating from ego. And when ego collides with structure, structure usually outlasts it. What I did next was later described by some people as retaliation. But that is not how I see it. I did not interfere with any mission-critical process. I did not corrupt data, erase configuration, or disrupt required uptime. What I did was stop performing certain non-essential maintenance courtesies that I had long carried out proactively in the background. Hourly cache clearing on an operations dashboard, suppression of low-toner alerts across a floor of printers, a handful of quality-of-life automations that were not central contractual obligations but had become part of the smooth office experience because I had quietly cared enough to maintain them for years. The effect was immediate and revealing. Nothing catastrophic happened at first. The system just became sticky. Dashboards slowed. Printers began complaining. People in operations started calling out across the room, asking whether anyone else was seeing freezes. I sat at my desk and kept documenting, typing, and monitoring, looking for all the world like a woman completely immersed in routine work. The only difference was that I was no longer absorbing every little friction point on behalf of people who had stopped noticing I was doing it. That, it turned out, was enough to make the whole office realize how much had been resting on my invisible labor. About an hour later, Mason reappeared, looking darker and much less certain. With Emily Parker from HR close behind him, wearing the unmistakable expression of someone who had just opened a file and discovered she had walked into legal quicksand. One glance at her face told me she had finally seen the contract. Removing me was not like escorting out an employee and disabling a badge. It was more like trying to disconnect a utility provider without understanding where the lines ran. As Mason passed, he hissed that I thought I was smart. I did not raise my voice. I simply told him I was expensive, and that those were not the same thing. He slammed his office door hard enough to rattle the glass, and I knew we had crossed another threshold. My phone buzzed soon afterward with a message from Daniel Mercer that was as brief and sharp as I expected from him. He was drafting a cease and desist response immediately. I was not to surrender anything. I was not to leave unless formal security procedures were invoked. If anyone touched my equipment, I was to call the police. Daniel has a particular kind of enthusiasm for blatant breach situations, as though every reckless executive email is a wrapped gift placed directly into his hands. While I was still reading his message, Victor called my desk line, sounding as tense as I had ever heard him. "Mason," he said. He was contacting an outside support outfit and claiming he was assembling a strike team to lock me out of the environment. I did not look away from the monitoring panel in front of me as I listened. I simply asked what exactly Mason thought he was going to disable. Victor replied that it sounded like everything he could reach. I told him, very evenly, that if they cut my profile without properly migrating the API keys hard-linked into the automated warehouse systems, every robot moving inventory in our major facilities would freeze in place. Tens of millions of dollars in goods would become beautifully organized paperweights. Victor went silent for several seconds before admitting he had not realized those dependencies were tied together so tightly. I told him that was precisely why the company had paid me for all these years, because somebody had to understand the parts everyone else only noticed when they failed. I knew the information would frighten him, but fear in the right place is useful. It can make sensible people stop before they touch the wrong thing. Ignorance is what had been protecting Mason's confidence for weeks. Proper fear might at least slow everyone else down. Unfortunately, the one person who most needed fear was the least capable of feeling it. By the time that call ended, I knew the situation was about to move beyond aggressive messaging and enter the far more dangerous stage, where ignorance starts laying hands on live infrastructure. The so-called strike team arrived later that afternoon. And if I had been in any other mood, I might have laughed out loud. 3 men walked into the office with the look of people pulled from a mid-range repair shop rather than a serious enterprise environment. One wore an old hoodie. One had the overstuffed backpack of a part-time lab assistant. And the third looked as if he had recently removed someone else's support logo from his shirt. Mason greeted them like reinforcements arriving at the front line. He gestured toward my area with gratitude, performative importance, and announced that they were going to migrate the entire database environment to a cheaper, more modern cloud platform he had procured. A service called Skybridge Cloud. The name alone made my stomach turn. It was exactly the kind of budget hosting environment suitable for small online stores trying to save money. Not for a logistics network handling regulated shipments, sensitive records, and operational dependencies across multiple facilities. I looked directly at Mason and told him, slowly and clearly, that he could not move this system onto a non-compliant platform. Doing so would violate regulatory requirements, break custody documentation, and expose the company to federal trouble on multiple fronts. He waved me off as if I were just a bitter technical holdout resisting progress. Then he instructed the outside technicians to plug in, run the migration wizard, and wipe the legacy environment so the company could have a clean start. That phrase alone almost made me physically ill. Mission-critical infrastructure is not a closet you reorganize because a new manager wants cleaner lines. But Mason was looking at it as if he were rearranging furniture. The difference between cosmetic change and structural intervention meant nothing to him. He wanted a visible win. He wanted speed. And he was fully prepared to gamble the company's operational spine to get both. When one of those technicians plugged a device into my main console, it felt like watching someone strike a match inside a chemical storage room and call it optimization. He squinted at the screen and announced that the system looked ancient because it was running a custom Linux kernel with proprietary modules. Mason seized on that observation instantly, as though technical unfamiliarity itself were proof of obsolescence, and told them to wipe the legacy code and push everything into a friendlier environment. I sent Victor a short message telling him they were attempting to re-image a production system and that he needed to stop them immediately. At the same time, I began pulling logs, capturing timestamps, and documenting every command they entered. I was not hacking them or launching some dramatic counterattack. I was building the truth record. I knew that if the system exploded in the next few minutes, the most important thing would not be who shouted loudest. It would be who could prove exactly what had happened. Their process through a conflict warning tied to a protected directory, marked so aggressively that any competent engineer would have stopped dead. One of the outside men actually hesitated and read the warning aloud. Mason did not hesitate for even half a second. He told him to override it. I stood up, looked directly at him, and explained that the directory contained the hash material tied to our encrypted backups. The very backbone of years of shipping, history, and custody records required by law. He ignored me and called for security as though my warning, delivered in full view of witnesses, they were a disruption rather than an act of professional responsibility. Walter Dean, our older security guard who had accepted holiday cookies from me for years, came over, wearing the confused expression of a man who had clearly not signed up for any of this. I took a breath, sat back down, and said I would not say another word. From that point on, I let them continue into the disaster I had just described out loud. Once the override was confirmed and the migration process began, the failure unfolded in the exact pattern technical people dread most. It did not explode all at once in a dramatic movie scene. It fractured layer by layer, slowly enough to create false hope, and quickly enough to outrun intervention. The first symptom was a flicker on the large dispatch displays. The green indicators representing hundreds of trucks moving across routes shifted color, stalled, and then froze. Someone shouted that tracking was lagging. Another dispatcher said she had a driver caught in severe weather and could not see his location anymore. The main dashboard went gray. A waiting wheel appeared, and the room moved from tense to chaotic in seconds. Mason, still drunk on his own managerial mythology, to try to reassure everyone that it was only temporary buffering during an upgrade. A normal resource reallocation that would settle down momentarily. It did not settle down. The next system to fail was internal telephony. Our voice infrastructure rides on the same network layers they had just flooded, with an unoptimized migration attempt. And once those packets started dropping, every line in the office effectively died. There is something eerie about a room full of working phones all becoming useless at once. It is followed by a chorus of people saying hello into silence. Victor came out of his office with his tie crooked and panic all over his face. Mason shouted back that he was modernizing the infrastructure and that some disruption was expected. Victor practically yelled that this was not manageable disruption. This was the backbone of a massive supply chain breaking in real time. I sat there watching my private monitoring console while errors rolled by faster than most people could read them. Database lock failures. API timeouts. Integrity violations. It looked like a waterfall of technical consequences, each one tied directly to a decision Mason had made while ignoring explicit warnings. The worst part was that I could tell he still did not understand what he was seeing. He knew things were going wrong. He just did not yet grasp how much of his own future was dying with every new error line. The fatal blow landed when the automated billing process started. That routine was scheduled to run every day, quietly pulling shipping data from the main database and generating invoices for customers without anyone needing to think about it. Under normal conditions, it was invisible and reliable. Exactly the way good automation should be. But with the database half mangled by their migration attempt, the queries began returning empty values. And because the billing system was programmed to fail safely from a certain accounting perspective, it defaulted those missing values to 0. I watched the outgoing message queue start climbing and felt the cold move through my spine. Hundreds of emails, then more. Then wave after wave of invoices showing $0 charges being sent to the company's largest clients. Retail giants. Major partners. High-sensitivity accounts that should never have received anything inaccurate, let alone a mass statement implying they owed nothing. I finally broke my silence and told Mason that he had just sent free shipping invoices to some of the biggest customers in the portfolio. I have rarely seen a man change color so quickly. He turned on me instantly, ordering me to stop it. Cancel it. Fix it. I held up my hands and reminded him that I was, according to his own reckless action that morning, no longer authorized. He shouted that I had to repair it because he needed it repaired, but his panic did not magically restore legal authority. He had attempted to terminate services and then expected immediate emergency intervention without reinstatement, without a work order, and without any valid contractual standing. I told him that if he wanted my help, he would need a proper reactivation of my agreement and written authorization. He threatened lawsuits. He threatened arrest. I looked at him with the flat exhaustion of a woman who had spent years watching incompetent people confuse rage with leverage. The real agony for Mason in that moment was not just the broken billing. It was the realization that the one person who could truly stabilize the situation was the same woman he had tried to humiliate and remove with one arrogant message. Panic makes unqualified people do the worst possible thing. And one of the outside technicians proved that in spectacular fashion, while the room was thick with shouting, dead phones, and rapidly escalating confusion. He yanked the storage device out of the console without any safe shutdown sequence. Everything went black almost immediately. Not just my station, not just the dispatch wall. Every display connected to the smart building controls dropped out together. The main office lighting failed as the automation layer reset into error states, and emergency illumination flickered on with that ugly institutional glow that makes every face look sick. In that greenish light, Mason's phone began to ring. I saw him glance at the screen and go pale. It was the reminder for his quarterly performance presentation to investors, the meeting he had likely intended to use as a showcase for his bold reform agenda. He grabbed his tablet, hurried into his glass office, stacked it on top of a few documents, smoothed his hair, straightened his posture, and put on the expression of a man trying desperately to look in control of an environment that had already slipped beyond him. Watching it was equal parts appalling and absurd. Outside his office, the fleet dashboard was dead. $0 invoices were flying out. Internal communication was crippled. And yet he still seemed to think the right phrasing could contain the truth. He tried to wrap collapse in language like stress testing and quality assurance, as though a better label might change the underlying reality. But technology does not care what spin you put on failure. It does not respect hierarchy, presentation skills, or salary bands. It answers only to structure, configuration, and consequence. That, more than anything, is why corporate power has always looked flimsy to me. Strip away stable infrastructure, and the polished exterior falls off very quickly. In that awful emergency light, Mason no longer looked like an executive leading transformation. He looked like a man who had kicked open a machine room door and discovered too late that the machinery could crush him. From where I sat, I could hear fragments of Mason's investor call spilling out through the glass. At first, his voice had that practiced executive brightness, the tone people use when they think confidence can crowd out evidence. He described what was happening as minor technical difficulty, then as a broad systems, stress exercise, then as part of responsible quality controls. The voices on the other end were not fooled. One of the investors asked to see the fleet metrics immediately, saying they were already hearing from partners about irregularities. Mason tried to explain that the company was in the middle of a migration to Skybridge Cloud. The moment he said that name, the entire mood shifted. Another voice cut in, colder this time, asking why compliance-sensitive records were being moved to a budget platform that was never designed for this class of infrastructure. Mason tried to reposition the tablet so the camera would not show the darkened office behind him. But in his haste, he only managed to angle it toward the chaos. Then one of the investors asked the question that mattered most: where was Claire Bennett? The person who actually knew the architecture. Mason said, I was dealing with a personal matter. I was not about to let that lie survive. I stood up and said clearly that I was right there. The whole room seemed to stop breathing. Mason lunged to block the view. But I walked to the glass wall and held up my phone with a message in large text. System failure, caused by unauthorized migration, performed by unvetted personnel. Data integrity at risk. Federal compliance endangered. In the dim, ugly light of that broken office, it would have been impossible to miss. A voice on the call immediately ordered Mason to end the presentation. Stop touching everything. And expect direct contact from the board. I remember looking at him in that moment and thinking that the most devastating part of what had happened was not that I had outmaneuvered him. It was that all I had really done was tell the truth at the exact moment he could no longer hide from it. When the call ended, the office dropped into a silence so dense that it felt almost physical. Then the whispering began, spreading with the speed of office gossip and the weight of genuine fear. No one was looking at Mason the same way anymore. A few hours earlier, he had been the imported vice president who was supposedly going to transform the company. Now he was just a man standing in a good suit inside the wreckage of his own authority. Power built on title alone disappears very quickly once it is separated from actual control. I sat back down and opened the restoration pathways tied to my clean encrypted backups. I started reassembling what mattered most. Verifying dependencies, preserving evidence, and bringing critical services back carefully enough that I would not contaminate either the technical scene or the legal one. I was not doing it as a favor to Mason. I was doing it because too many things larger than him depended on those systems returning as fast as possible. Real shipments, real customers, real operations outside this office that did not deserve to suffer because one arrogant executive had mistaken dominance for competence. That has always been the difference, to me, between vengeance and professional integrity. Even after being threatened, disrespected, and treated as if my work could be replaced with a wizard and a budget subscription, I still understood that protecting the system mattered more than indulging the temptation to let him drown in the consequences alone. Daniel kept sending updates, confirming legal action had gone out, and that nobody was authorized to remove me or touch my equipment. Victor hovered nearby, looking as though he had aged 5 years in one afternoon. Nobody was talking about workshops now. Nobody was talking about synergy. The office had returned to its oldest and most honest rule. When the building is on fire, people stop listening to performers and start listening to the person who knows where the shutoff valves are. In that noisy silence, I knew the balance of power had flipped completely. By the end of the evening, I had restored the system from clean, encrypted backups. rebuilt the critical links, brought the operational dashboards back online, isolated the damage caused by the forced migration attempt, and documented every trace necessary for both the technical record and the legal one. I left the office late, tired to the bone, but not with the bitterness people might expect. What I felt instead was a cold clarity. Mason Blake was not going to last. That much was obvious before the night was even over. By the next morning, I was in direct discussion with the board. There were no more layers of vague management language. No more attempts to reduce me to a generic technical resource. And no more confusion about the difference between the woman holding up the infrastructure and an expense line someone could casually cut. A new agreement was put in front of me with dramatically improved compensation, a longer term, direct board oversight, and veto authority over major technical changes. Some people would call that a victory. Maybe it was. But the part that mattered most to me was the lesson the entire company had been forced to relearn. Some people look ordinary enough that others assume they can be overlooked, dismissed, or talked down to without consequence. Right up until the system stopped responding, and everyone realizes how much of their world was resting on that person's competence. I never needed a spotlight to understand my worth. I only needed the truth, returned to its proper place. Mason lasted less than a month in the company. My 11-year engagement was extended for years beyond that. People often think the house always wins because it is larger than any one individual. What they forget is that sometimes the person they tried to treat as expendable is the one who built the table, set the rules, and decided who would still be standing after the noise of arrogance finally burned itself out.